Mr. Mano. Some argue that the vaccination passport is reminiscent of the notorious dome pass from the apartheid era. Now, do you think that this is an accurate comparison?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm smiling, but I don't think I'm really supposed to be smiling. I don't think it is a very, I haven't heard this personally, but I was a bit shocked to hear this. I think the only real comparison that you can draw, if you then want to draw one, which I think is not a fair one, and I'll explain why, is I suppose it restricts movement. I suppose the Dompas restricted movement on the basis of race, and the possibility of a vaccination passport would restrict movement in a similar fashion. But there are, to my mind, three very important differences between the historical Dompas and the possibility of a vaccination passport. The first is, I think, there's a much bigger difference in intent. To my mind, prima facie, I have not heard anything today here. I have seen it in popular media, but I think the intent with the vaccination is to my mind, bona fide. Now, it is a positive intent. We want to vaccinate people to preserve life, at least on a prima facie basis. So I've heard other arguments. I believe that is why it is, but I've heard other arguments. Basis, we can say that the vaccination is there to save lives. It is there to prevent infection and prevent serious illness if you are then indeed infected. The Dompas was there to preserve a racial superiority. That is a mala fide. That is with bad intent from the get-go. So that is the first is the difference. And the second big thing is you cannot change your race. It is impossible to change your race. So the Dompas had a specific application on a person who was not white, whatever race they were. And it was something that you could not escape. Whereas something such as a vaccination passport is something we can change. It is something that is changeable. You can go get vaccinated if you so wish. I also think the other aspect, the third one, is it is not as if there's an indirect discrimination where we are all required to pay for our own vaccinations. Government has gone, and I suspect to great lengths, to ensure that vaccines are free of charge. Now, I don't know, I am doubly vaccinated with Pfizer, and I can tell you the first time I stood in a queue a little while, the second time I walked in and I walked out. It is not as if the vaccination sites, and I've heard this is not very good empirical data, but from what I've seen and from what I've spoken, it's not as if the vaccination sites are currently overflowing. So those three things make it different. The one is there to save and preserve life. The other was there to keep racial superiority. That was what the Dompas was. The second thing is you couldn't change your race. There was nothing you could do about it, but you can all get vaccinated. And the third one links with that, saying that government is providing the vaccination. And the last thing, requiring mandatory vaccinations is not a new thing. It's not an odd thing. For many, many years, if you wanted to travel to several countries, you were required to be vaccinated against certain diseases. Sure, that is international travel. I suppose this one speaks to local travel. I am not so sure, but if you look at yellow fever, I once went up to, I traveled up in Africa and I was required to get a yellow fever shot and I did not think twice about it. I think maybe you can draw a comparison in the very premature sense that sure, it restricts movement. But you know what? A driver's license also restricts movement. You're not allowed to drive without a driver's license. For the three reasons I mentioned, I think it is a very inaccurate and an insensitive comparison, to be quite frank.
Thank you, Mr. Mano. Moving on to our last question for the day. Has the government provided the public with sufficient information and education on the different vaccinations in a way that is accessible and comprehensible, particularly to portions of the population with a very minimal education background? Now, does a failure to do so fuel the public's distrust of government in this regard? This question is posed to both Mr. Manu and Dr. Tani.
Sorry, can you just, you broke up on that very last word. Who's the question posed to?
Both to you, Mr. Mano, and Dr. Tani, but you can start.
Yeah.
On the different vaccinations in a way that is both accessible and comprehensible, particularly to portions of the population with a very minimal education background? And does the failure to do so fuel the public's distrust of government in this regard?
Okay, so in my opinion, that I feel, you know what, I'm not towards one thing. I feel we've been given info as to whether it's getting to all other areas in the country. I feel like people in rural areas are still a bit skeptical about the vaccine, and that's the people that we need to target more. As to whether as a failure to do so for the public discourse. And then another thing, I feel government still needs to do more to educate people about the vaccine. And also, we never really, from my side, we never received clarity as to whether, remember there were rumors running around about how the vaccine, some people died from the vaccine. And that's what I think some of the public are a bit skeptical about in terms of getting vaccinated. So for me, in my opinion, the government can do more. We can educate more, talk about it more, and try and get more people accessible. So far, the vaccination sites that have been doing well so far, it's mostly that I've experienced either in towns, in rural areas, it's very, very slow in my opinion. And then I'm gonna head it over to Narma. I don't know about you. For me, we haven't done enough in terms of people that are in the rural areas to try and get them on board and have the vaccine sites accessible to them. It just hasn't been enough for me.
Mhm. Thank you, Doc. Yes, I agree with Dr. Tani, but I think in fairness, I have to admit a few things. The first is I am doubly vaxxed myself. So I believe in the vaccination. I trust the vaccination. I don't think, the reason I trust the vaccination is because I tend to trust science. It doesn't mean it's infallible. Nah? There are always issues. Dr. Tani is an anesthetist. We all know what risks there are just with normal anesthesia, the simple procedures. I teach medical law as well, so I have quite an understanding of the issues that can happen in routine procedures and the negative reactions that people can have with routine. The second thing is, and this is on a personal note, but it honestly affected my view severely, is my mother passed away from COVID in July. My mother was a 51-year-old woman. She had no comorbidities. She was not overweight and she was not vaccinated. And my mother, a 51-year-old woman, healthy in a private hospital, passed away from COVID-19. So if you ask me, do we have enough information regarding COVID-19? My answer would be no, because all people aren't vaccinated yet. I think if you truly take up the information, then there's not enough because the people have not vaccinated yet. The last thing I just wanted to make a point of, my question is this only the responsibility of government? I think we must understand in South Africa that there is a massive distrust of our government. And if I can be frank, I think rightfully so. I think the South African government has on so many aspects disappointed and led to the distrust that we have. So has there been done enough? No. Can government do more? Yes. But I think in the final instance, I would specifically say it's not only the work of government. It's a work of the entire community. This fake news nonsense, the WhatsApp chats that are being sent, something has to be done. And I think a lot of it can be done by you and me, by doctors in private sector, by entities such as the university, etc. But in short, no, I will be happy if everyone is vaccinated.
Thank you, Mano. There is a question that is posed, and now we are opening the floor for questions from the audience. It comes from Caroline, and she says, I think with regards to the proportionality test, we need to take cognizant of Black history in terms of vaccine and medical testing and on the aspect of religion.
Okay, may I answer to that? Is that all right? Caroline, yes. Again, a wonderful question. I just spoke of about the distrust. And I don't know, I read it in a newspaper one time, so this is not incredibly accurate knowledge. But what I also saw was tendency toward the vaccine in South Africa was higher among white Afrikaans populations than any other group. They were the single highest group. Right? My family, the white Afrikaners are the most distrustful. And I think links to a distrust of governments. And I think the issue that Caroline raises is important. There's a historical distrust. My question is the following, and this is an open question. It is one that I do not have a solid answer for. I have some idea, but I do not have a solid answer for it. Is my remark there is, when a court decides, do we look at science, at fact, or do we look at public opinion? And I say again, it is not an absolute, there isn't a good answer. Because what happens if public opinion goes against legal facts? I'm going to take a wacko example, but it is an example. If we had to go on public opinion, same-sex marriages would still not be legalized. Because there's this belief that sexual orientation is a choice. And that often stems from religion. But the science does not agree with it. So my question is, when we are looking at law, when we are working with law, and again, I say, I'm not posing an answer. I'm actually answering your question with a question, is to what extent do we rely on science, and to what extent do we rely on subjective experience and subjective belief? It's a difficult thing to take into account. She raises a very good point. We can chat about that for hours in and of itself. I am happy if Caroline poses an answer. I don't know about that.
Yes, other... Caroline, can you please unmute yourself?
Oh, hi. Yes, thanks for allowing for me to actually answer and engage the speakers. Thank you to Legal Shipping for facilitating this thing. Marnu, Doctor, this has been quite insightful. I am a legal academic like Marnu. We actually are very much familiar with each other. How I want to answer this question, Marnu, is that we speak about government distrust and state distrust, which is accurate. And to me, that you say the people who are actually reluctant and are giving the vaccine the cold shoulder is historically advantaged group, which is our white Afrikaans males. And then it brings in the critical race element to this thing, is that historically, Black people do not trust vaccines and medicine testing because they were used as guinea pigs. A lot of issues in the Black families where they developed all sorts of illnesses. So it went from that to then they're using animals. Then there was an uprising of animal rights. Then medicine had to find a way on how to test their vaccines. I think that is a general and that is a genuine, and people should sit down and try and speak about it. And I'm thinking that we should not be outrightly aggressive to people who do not want to vaccinate, because from some aspect, the chats and the concerns that they are bringing is quite genuine, and we should look into it. And I am saying, yes, there's been a failure, maybe from our part as citizens and government with regards to having the direct channels in order to investigate and to educate the community as to how does this vaccine work and why you should trust us. So again, you're saying that with this vaccine now, I think this is the first vaccine that has been put in post-apartheid South Africa, where it's a predominantly Black government, not predominantly, it is a Black government, Blackness from a different racial group. So how do those tensions, and it's nuanced, now I'm bringing a very nuanced conversation where we can't just say you're an anti-vaxxer and just go vaccinate. When genuine chats like this are being brought past, when you speak about the proportionality test, I'm thinking about the MEC versus Pillay, Marnu, if you can just jog my memory, but some of it there, it was on the grounds of religion that she did not, what Pillay not take again?
In Palais, it was a matter. It wasn't really religion. It was more cultural in the end.
Yes,
But
yes,
you wore a nose stud,
yes.
and the school did not permit it.
And the school did not permit it, and it was said it's cultural, and they kind of inflicted with religion and stuff like that. So I think this chat that we're having on the distrust of government, this government and the apartheid government, that tension exists now, and it brings in a set of critical race theory. That conversation should be had and should be interrogated.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I did not add that. Although I am doubly vaxxed, and although I strongly want everyone to be vaccinated, I completely agree with Caroline and actually with what Doc said, that patient autonomy and freedom of the person is a constitutional right that I find very important. And I completely agree with Caroline on the notion that those who are currently refusing to vaccinate should not be harshly judged. We should not have an aggressive and attacktive approach toward them. We should open the discussion, and we should open the dialogue. As much as I want each and every single student to vaccinate, I will be quite unhappy. I will be quite unhappy if a court finds in favor of a mandatory vaccination for university students. To my reading of the Constitution, and I had such big fights with my colleagues, they do not agree with me, but I do not think it would be constitutional. And in the last instance, I think it would do a lot more damage. I think we would create a lot more resistance against the vaccine if we force the vaccine. The only point I wanted to make was, due to the distrust in government, I think that the onus naturally shifts onto other parties who is not the government to also aid and helping in trust with the vaccination.
If everybody can hear me, I just wanted to add one point to that. Just to add on to what Marnus and what Caroline said, I do agree, but you must remember, even when you educate patients, how people were raised and their beliefs plays a big role in whether patients believe things like whether they should be vaccinated or not. So we can give all the education that we can give, but there's still going to be some people with certain beliefs that they've been raised with. And for them, it's a bit of a sour topic where they're like, you know what, I don't believe in vaccination. But remember how we raised and what our beliefs play quite an important role. One example is, for example, if you have a Jehovah's Witness to this day, Witness to say, listen, we are gonna transfuse you because it's a life or death situation. We still need the autonomy to them to say, listen, these are the pros and the cons of me getting a blood transfusion. It is to save your life, but we still leave it to the patient as to whether they will agree for the blood transfusion to be done. Even if with our black topic with our education background, just making the vaccine mandatory to a point where we force it upon people and we take away their autonomy, that would not be fair. Because I feel everyone is entitled to their autonomy. And that, remember, even when they say they want to get herd immunity, we're not hoping for 100%. Because then, if I have certain beliefs against vaccination, then so be it. And I should be allowed to make the decision and say, listen, I don't want it, and I don't see why you should force it upon me for me to do it. So we still have a long way to go. I mean, even in my line of work, for example, we still have patients that believe that if you started a traditional healer and they'll go to a traditional healer, and we do allow patients for that. And we don't force patients. If I diagnose a patient and say, listen, I believe you do have cancer and they believe it's something spiritual that needs to be sorted out by a traditional healer, we do let them be. So even in the topic of vaccines, I think for me, in my opinion, it should be open to patients having their own autonomy. It should not be mandatory to a certain group where they say you either vaccinated or you don't. either be it in a university or so. But like I said, it's my personal opinion. And just to add something, someone on the chat had asked me about studies on COVID. Just so they know, I I am not directly treating COVID patients at the moment. So what I know is very minimal, and a practitioner would know. If you guys want to have this discussion, I mean, I'm in an academic institution. If you want to get a virologist involved, where you can ask them questions that are specific towards COVID, please let me know, guys. I'm willing to help in any way that I can.
Thank you, Dr. Tadi. We have 8 minutes remaining. So are there any more questions that the audience would like to pose? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hello.
Am I? Oh.
Yeah,
Yes.
Boris.
Yeah, I see Boris and Chris asked the question. It doesn't matter who goes first. I think Zipo might decide whose question will answer first.
We'll just go with Chris's question first, because I think it's a bit short. He asked, would mandatory vaccinations for healthcare workers be permissible as opposed to students? I think you did touch on this question, Mano. Can you please give him a brief answer?
I'll say it in less than a minute. To me, a question of a mandatory vaccination will have to be assessed on a case-by-case basis if we look purely at constitutional law. Two requirements: law of general application and the proportionality analysis. I think an argument can be Section 36(1). You will see a lot of elements that have to be taken into account when you are addressing the proportionality analysis. The purpose of the restriction, etc., etc. My point would be, contact with people who have COVID-19 every single day. They work with them face to face. Students do not share the same risk. The healthcare workers are a lot higher risk. The reality that I also have an issue with, or when I think about a mandatory vaccination for UP students, for example, which I say again, they are not. I'm saying they're pursuing it. They're not currently pursuing it. They made that clear. But if they do that, the reality is if you and I go to Pick and Pay, we are going to stand in a queue next to someone who was not vaccinated. So in short, absolutely, I think it has to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. The same would go for a carer of elderly people, people who work with people. Will make a very strong case that they have to be vaccinated. The same would go for a lecturer. I think you can make a case that the disruption if a lecturer becomes ill is a lot more severe than when a single student becomes ill. Who's going to teach the course to the 800? So to my mind, it has to be taken on a case-by-case basis. Wonderful question, Caroline. I think vaccination status will be a Section 9(3). But let's first listen to Boris. He was next.
Okay, we do have 5 minutes remaining. So if we can just keep the answers and the questions short. Boris?
Okay, I actually had 3 questions, but I'll try to limit them to just 1 or maybe 2. The first one is that let's assume that South Africa, everybody is vaccinated mandatory-wise. All of us are vaccinated. But then that's going to leave the question of international students, the international community. What if they're coming from a place that did not have mandatory vaccinations and they have to come in here now? Must they themselves be forced to vaccinate when they made the decision in their own country not to be vaccinated? Secondly, would that not then leave the international student body outside of the realms of the schooling, basically? Will that mean that UP or universities will be are not on campus, those who are international, or would they be now just focusing on those who are here? Because that's, I feel like, is the risk that runs with mandatory vaccination, assuming we all get vaccinated. And secondly, let's assume that as things are right now, we keep the mandatory, the standard, the status quo, which is that, like, look, you don't have to be vaccinated, you can be vaccinated. If we are all arguing against the mandatory vaccination, does that not mean in a way we are also all arguing against going back to the normal? And of course, that means in a sense, we're all arguing against getting everybody becoming employable again, because a lot of jobs had to get rid of a lot of people because they didn't have what? Because of the corona outbreak. So then are we not actually sort of like advocating for all the damage that corona has caused when we say let's not make it mandatory? Those are my two questions. I'll keep it there.
I'm going to respond very shortly on the first part. From my understanding, and I know this also because I have some friends who are foreigners, the vaccinations are available, those that UP provide and the ones that government provide, to all people, not only South African citizens. You are free to register for the vaccination with a passport number, and more specifically those that UP provide. So I hope that answers the first question. I don't think international students will be excluded from, and as far as I know, entering into South Africa, vaccination is not required. It's only, well, we don't even have any mandatory requirements yet, but we might have. And their government vaccinates all people within the borders.
Just to add a quick answer to Boris. Remember, we must always go back to why they would want us to be vaccinated. Remember, it's for us to get herd immunity, and we're trying to prevent severe disease as well as trying to reduce the burden on the healthcare system. That's how we got into lockdown. We're trying to reduce the burden of on the healthcare system, and it was quite terrible. I can tell you as a first-line worker that when the different waves of COVID came by, it was quite access to healthcare. People had access, but we ran out of ventilators. So we're trying to prevent it. That's why we keep going to a lower level whenever we have low cases. So we must always come back to that if people are not vaccinated, they run the risk of getting severe disease, running the risk of needing more public, be at risk of overburdening our public health system, of which even without COVID, I honestly don't think our public system is up to like the standard that it should be. It cannot, we really cannot be, and it doesn't have the capacity to keep the amount of people in the country, and not everyone has access to it. That's my 2 cents on it. Just let's remember why we want people to be vaccinated. And as to whether international people can, whether we have making mandatory for international students, I still stand by saying let's not infringe on a person's autonomy, always leave it to them. But that's why it's our responsibility as a healthcare workers and the government as a whole to educate the public as to why we want them to be vaccinated.
Thank you very much, Doc. We are going to round up our session now. As I've stated and I've mentioned at the beginning of the session, that this is our last shebeen as the 2020-2021 EC. And I would just like to leave you with a proverb that says, knowledge is like a garden. If it is not cultivated, it cannot be harvested. And thank you to everyone who has joined us and our panelists. This was a very informative session. I do believe that everyone here left with a bit of knowledge, with a little bit more of knowledge than they came in with the session with. Thank you very much, everyone. You will be sent the link, the YouTube link for the recorded session. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you for inviting me. All of the best.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored. Okay.